Tom Grayson had been looking forward to retirement for years. After 4 decades as a high school principal, he and his wife, Linda, finally found the perfect home in Willow Creek Estates, a quiet, well-manicured community just outside of Dallas. The neighborhood was peaceful, full of retired professionals, friendly dog walkers, and an HOA that kept things from getting too out of hand. It seemed perfect. Then they met Karen Thompson. Karen lived directly across the street in a massive, overly renovated McMansion that was twice as expensive as it had any right to be. She was pushing 60 but dressed like a 30-year-old influencer, and her personality could only be described as a human hurricane with an overinflated ego. Everyone in the neighborhood knew Karen. She was the type to record people's trash days to report violations, harass the HOA over Christmas decorations being too bright, and yell at the local UPS driver if he even grazed her mailbox. And now, she had a new target. Tom and Linda had barely been in their house for 2 weeks when they decided to add a gazebo to their spacious backyard. It was nothing fancy, a simple wooden structure tucked in the corner of their yard, surrounded by string lights. It was for evening tea, reading, and occasional family gatherings. But Karen saw it as a personal attack. The first confrontation. The trouble started on a Thursday afternoon. Tom had just finished arranging the patio chairs under the gazebo when he heard the sound of heels clicking aggressively against pavement. He turned and saw Karen marching up his driveway, clipboard in hand, her manicured nails tapping impatiently on the metal. "Excuse me," she called, her voice sharp enough to cut glass. Tom, being a reasonable man, smiled politely. "Hi there. Can I help you?" Karen huffed, flipping her platinum blonde bob over her shoulder. "I was just wondering," she said, her tone drenched in passive aggression, "if you got approval for that thing in your backyard." Tom blinked. "The gazebo?" Karen crossed her arms. "Yes, the structure that is clearly violating the neighborhood's aesthetic guidelines." Tom frowned. "It's in my backyard. I didn't think." "You didn't think?" Karen cut him off, giving a fake laugh. "Oh, sweetie, that's not how it works here." Tom, feeling his blood pressure rise, took a deep breath. "We check with the HOA before installing it," he said calmly. "It meets all the guidelines." Karen's smile froze. That was not the answer she wanted. "Well," she snapped, "I'll have to verify that." She tapped her clipboard. "Because I don't recall ever approving it." Tom raised an eyebrow. "You're on the HOA?" Karen hesitated. "Not officially," she admitted, "but I advise the board on important matters." Tom had met her type before. The kind of person who appointed themselves as an authority on everything without actually having any power. "I'll let the HOA handle it," he said, turning back toward his house. "Have a nice day." Karen's eye twitched, and that's when war was declared. The reign of petty terror begins. By the next morning, Karen had filed an official complaint with the HOA. By afternoon, she was patrolling the street, knocking on doors, trying to rally other neighbors to protest the gazebo. By evening, she was spamming the community Facebook page with posts like, "Should neighbors be allowed to build whatever they want? Where do we draw the line? Next, it'll be tiny homes and chicken coops. HOA leadership is failing US. Time for a change. I shouldn't have to look out my window and see a tacky wooden shack. This is Willow Creek, not the backwoods." Of course, most of the residents ignored her. But that didn't stop Karen. When the HOA formally rejected her complaint, she took matters into her own hands. First, she started reporting Tom and Linda for everything. Trash bins left out for too long, even when they weren't. Sidewalk cracks she insisted were a safety hazard. A car parked too close to her mailbox, even though it wasn't. When that didn't work, she escalated. Tom woke up one morning to find his sprinklers mysteriously broken. A few days later, someone had dumped a pile of mulch in his driveway. And then, the worst offense of all, someone had stolen his Amazon packages. Linda, usually a calm and reasonable woman, was fuming. "This is ridiculous," she said. "She's trying to harass us into leaving." Tom nodded. "She underestimates how stubborn I am." Karen's HOA takeover attempt. One thing about Karen, she didn't just want to complain, she wanted power. If she couldn't win against Tom and Linda, she was going to force her way into the HOA and rewrite the rules herself. So, she launched a campaign to run for HOA president. Flyers were taped to every mailbox. Emails were sent out, full of concerns about the current leadership. At a community meeting, she stood up, adjusted her Gucci blazer, and declared, "I believe Willow Creek deserves a leader who truly understands what's best for the community. Someone who isn't afraid to enforce the rules and preserve our property values." The room was silent. Then someone coughed. Then, from the back of the room, old Mr. Jensen, who had lived in Willow Creek for 30 years, laughed. And not just a chuckle, a full, wheezing, couldn't control himself kind of laugh. Karen's face turned red. "What's so funny?" Mr. Jensen wiped his eyes. "Karen, you've been trying to get people fined for Christmas lights. No one's voting for you." A murmur of agreement rippled through the crowd. Karen, furious, turned to the HOA president, Diane Miller. "This is rigged," she shrieked. "I demand a recount." Diane sighed. "Karen, we haven't even voted yet." The results came in 10 minutes later. Karen got 2 votes, one from herself and one from her husband, Jeff, who looked deeply embarrassed. Tom got 47 votes. Karen stormed out, but not before screeching at the entire neighborhood. "You'll regret this. I'm going to sue every single one of you." The meeting adjourned. Tom turned to Linda and smirked. "I think we just made an enemy for life." Linda sighed. "I just hope she doesn't get worse." But, of course, Karen did. Karen Thompson was not the type to admit defeat. After her humiliating HOA election loss, she disappeared for a few days. No Facebook rants, no passive-aggressive emails, not even a single complaint about parking violations. Tom and Linda should have known that meant trouble, because Karen wasn't done fighting. She was just reloading. Karen's power play. Exactly 1 week after the election, the entire neighborhood received an email from Karen Thompson's Community Improvement Committee. Subject: Urgent HOA reforms needed. Dear neighbors, in recent weeks, it has become clear that our HOA is failing to maintain the high standards we expect in Willow Creek Estates. Property values are at risk, rules are being ignored, and it is time for serious changes. I am proposing a special HOA meeting to discuss emergency reforms, including stronger enforcement of architectural guidelines, more unauthorized structures, new parking rules to prevent non-residents from taking our spaces, increased penalties for HOA violations because fines should actually mean something. If you care about keeping this neighborhood beautiful, you must attend this meeting. Regards, Karen Thompson, community leader and advocate. Tom read the email twice and shook his head. She really thinks she runs this place. Linda sighed. So, what's the plan? Ignore it? Tom grinned. No, I'm going. Linda frowned. Why? Because, Tom said, I want to see how spectacularly she crashes and burns. The special HOA meeting. That Saturday afternoon, Karen set up folding chairs and a podium in the clubhouse meeting room, acting as if she was hosting a mayoral debate. Tom walked in, grabbed some free cookies from the refreshment table, and sat down. Only about 7 other people showed up. Karen stood at the front, flipping through a PowerPoint presentation on a projector screen labeled, Restoring Willow Creek's Prestige, a Plan for a Better Future. Tom nearly choked on his cookie. Karen launched into a speech about how neighborhood standards were declining, how rule breakers were ruining their peaceful community, and how she was stepping up to save them from disaster. Then, she proudly announced her biggest reform idea, a Karen Patrol, a self-appointed group, led by Karen, of course, that would have the authority to hand out citations and fines for violations. Tom glanced at Bob Simmons, an ex-cop who had lived in Willow Creek for 20 years. Bob muttered under his breath, This woman wants her own neighborhood police force? Karen continued, If the HOA won't enforce the rules, I will. Residents should be able to report violations directly to me, and I will ensure they are handled appropriately. Tom couldn't help it. He laughed out loud. Karen's eyes snapped to him. Something funny, Tom? Tom leaned back in his chair. Oh no, Karen. Please continue. This is hilarious. Karen's face darkened. It's not hilarious. It's necessary. Bob raised a hand. Karen, even if the HOA wanted this, which they don't, your little patrol would be illegal. You can't go around finding people like some self-appointed sheriff. Karen huffed. Well, Maybe the law should change. Tom smirked. Maybe you should run for actual office. Then Karen's nostrils flared. If no one cares about this neighborhood, then fine. But don't come crying to me when this place turns into a trailer park. That was the final straw. Bob stood up, shaking his head. I'm done. This is a joke. The few remaining neighbors followed, muttering disbelief as they left. Tom stood and clapped sarcastically. Great meeting, Karen. Real productive. Karen glared daggers at him. This isn't over. Tom grinned. Oh, I know. Karen's revenge again. Losing the HOA election was bad. Getting laughed out of her own special meeting was worse. Karen snapped. Within days, she started ignoring HOA rules herself, convinced that if she couldn't control them, they didn't apply to her. First, she expanded her driveway without a permit, pouring concrete over part of the sidewalk, forcing pedestrians to step into the street. Second, she parked in other people's driveways, claiming that since the HOA doesn't enforce rules properly, why should she? Third, she planted massive private property signs all over her front lawn, even though no one was trespassing. And then, she bribed an HOA officer. Diane Miller, the HOA president, caught Karen handing an envelope to a junior officer, filled with gift cards and cash. When Diane asked, Karen shrugged. I was just encouraging them to enforce the rules properly. Diane was done. The HOA fined Karen $5,000 for illegal driveway expansion, blocking pedestrian access, unauthorized signage, attempting to bribe an officer. Karen lost her mind. She showed up to the next HOA meeting screaming about corrupt leadership and threatening to sue every single board member. Diane, calm as ever, simply slid a copy of Karen's signed HOA agreement across the table and said, Karen, if you don't like the rules, you're welcome to move. Karen froze. For the first time, she realized something. She wasn't winning. And worse, the entire neighborhood was against her. That's when Karen made the dumbest decision of all. The lawsuit that changed everything. Karen, being Karen, wasn't about to accept defeat. She filed a ridiculous lawsuit against the HOA for unfair persecution, Tom and Linda for psychological harassment, the city itself for incompetence in managing residential disputes. The case was so absurd that the judge didn't even schedule a hearing. He threw it out immediately. And because frivolous lawsuits waste the court's time, Karen was slapped with $10,000 in legal fees. And that's when reality hit her. She had lost. Completely. Her bank account was bleeding. Her neighbors hated her. Her reputation was in ruins. But instead of accepting responsibility, Karen went full villain. If she couldn't win fairly, she'd take matters into her own hands. And that's how Karen became a criminal. Karen Thompson had finally crossed the point of no return. After losing the HOA election, failing to get her ridiculous rules enforced, and getting her lawsuit laughed out of court, she had run out of options. Or at least, that's what a sane person would think. But Karen wasn't sane. She wasn't just angry. She was obsessed. If the HOA, the city, and the courts wouldn't give her power, she'd take it by force. And that's when she turned to crime. Karen's secret war begins. One quiet evening, Tom sat on his porch, enjoying his iced tea and listening to the distant hum of crickets. Then, crack. The sound of wood splintering echoed down the street. Tom frowned. He knew that sound. It was a chainsaw. That's when he saw her. Karen, wrapped in a tacky, rhinestone-covered tracksuit, was standing in her neighbor's yard, watching as two shady-looking men hacked away at a massive oak tree. A tree that wasn't hers. Tom walked over, phone already recording. Karen, what the hell are you doing? Karen turned, smiling like she wasn't committing felony-level property damage. Oh, Tom, she chirped. I'm just doing the neighborhood a favor. This ugly old tree is blocking the view of my house, and I just thought, why not take care of it? Tom narrowed his eyes. You don't own this property. Karen waved a hand dismissively. Details, details. The real homeowner, an elderly widow named Marjorie, came running out of her house in a panic. What are you doing? That's my tree, she cried. Karen sighed dramatically. Oh, Marjorie, come on. You were probably going to cut it down eventually, right? No need to thank me. Marjorie turned pale. "You're insane." Karen, clearly believing she was untouchable, just grinned. But Tom had already called the police. The arrest. By the time the cops showed up, the tree was halfway down, and Karen was still trying to convince Marjorie that she was actually helping her. Officer Martinez, the same no-nonsense cop who had already dealt with Karen's HOA stunts, stepped out of the patrol car and put his hands on his hips. "Oh, come on," he sighed. "Again?" Karen smirked. "Officer, this is just a misunderstanding. I'm simply helping an elderly neighbor by handling some much-needed landscaping." Officer Martinez looked at Marjorie, who was on the verge of a meltdown. "She's lying," Marjorie cried. "She's trespassing. She's destroying my property." The chainsaw-wielding workers, realizing they were about to be very arrested, dropped their tools and tried to run. Karen, however, stood her ground, fully convinced that she was above the law. "Let's be reasonable," she said sweetly. "I'm sure we can work something out." Officer Martinez sighed. "You're under arrest for trespassing, destruction of property, and unlawful tree removal." Karen's smug expression vanished. "Excuse me? You have the right to remain silent." The handcuffs clicked, and for the first time in her life, Karen was actually speechless. As the police dragged her toward the squad car, she screamed, "You can't do this. I'm the victim here." But nobody listened, especially not the dozens of neighbors filming from their porches. Karen's delusional defense. The arrest should have been the end of it. But Karen? She wasn't going down without a fight. She immediately posted bail, then went straight to social media, spinning the story into a bizarre sob story. Karen Thompson, victim of HOA corruption. "Today, I was wrongfully arrested for simply trying to beautify my community. The corrupt HOA and their lapdog police officers are trying to silence me. But I will not be bullied. Please share my story and stand with me." The comments were brutal. "Karen, you cut down someone else's tree. You're a criminal. No one likes you. Move." "This is the funniest thing I've seen all week." "Olmeo, you actually got arrested?" Karen deleted the post within hours. But it was too late. The entire town was talking about her public meltdown, and her court date was set. Karen versus the Courtroom. 3 weeks later, Karen walked into the county courthouse, draped in designer clothes, acting like she was walking into the Met Gala. She was representing herself, convinced that she could outsmart the system. Spoiler, she couldn't. The judge, a no-nonsense woman in her 60s, had zero patience for Karen's theatrics. "Mrs. Thompson," she said, adjusting her glasses, "do you understand the charges against you?" Karen smiled sweetly. "Yes, Your Honor. But let me explain." The judge held up a hand. No. Let's get to the evidence." Then, she played the security footage. There was Karen, grinning like a psychopath, watching as the tree was hacked apart. Karen's smile disappeared. The jury took exactly 40 minutes to reach a verdict. Guilty. The consequences. Karen was sentenced to 90 days of probation, 100 hours of community service, which included planting trees, ironically, $25,000 in fines to cover Marjorie's damages. But the real punishment came after. The HOA, seeing their chance to finally eliminate Karen, hit her with every violation possible. Her illegal driveway? $10,000 fine. Her oversized signs? Gone. Her unpaid HOA dues? Finally enforced. And then came the final blow. Karen, already drowning in legal fees, was forced to sell her house to cover the mounting costs. And just like that, the neighborhood villain was no more. Karen Thompson had spent years trying to rule Willow Creek Estates like a dictator. But now, she was about to lose everything. The eviction notice. The final straw came 1 month after her guilty verdict. Karen had been refusing to pay her fines, convinced she could somehow wiggle her way out of it. Then, one morning, a certified letter arrived at her doorstep. It was an eviction notice. Her house was being foreclosed. Her assets were frozen. She had 30 days to vacate the property. The news spread like wildfire. By the end of the day, half the neighborhood knew that Karen was officially done for. And the next morning, someone had printed copies of the eviction notice and taped them to every mailbox. Tom sat on his porch with a fresh cup of coffee, watching as Karen stormed outside, ripping the notices down while screaming, "This is slander. I'm suing everyone." Tom just smirked. No one was listening anymore. Karen's final act of defiance. Instead of accepting reality, Karen dug in her heels. She refused to move, calling the city, state, and even local news stations, trying to frame herself as a victim of a corrupt system. Her Facebook post, "I am being forced from my home by an illegal HOA conspiracy. This is a human rights violation. Please help me fight back." The response? "Karen, it's foreclosure. That's how debt works. Maybe don't break the law next time. LMAO karma. I'll donate $5 if it helps you leave faster." Desperate, she started a GoFundMe, hoping that some sympathetic souls would help her fight the injustice. Grand total raised? Back-end index pointing right, $35.67. Her own mother donated $10. Even Karen's biggest enablers had abandoned her. Eviction day. On a bright Monday morning, 2 sheriff's deputies arrived, officially evicting Karen from her home. She kicked, screamed, and tried to chain herself to the front door, but all it did was give the neighbors more footage for social media. By noon, everything Karen owned was being hauled onto the curb. Tom watched as she stood in the driveway, arms crossed, face beet red, as movers carried out her ridiculous designer furniture and stacks of HOA complaint forms. Linda shook her head. She really thought she was untouchable. Huh? Tom chuckled. Now she's just untouchable trash. Across the street, neighbors gathered with lawn chairs, lemonade, and even a few beers, enjoying the spectacle. Someone started playing celebratory music. And then, the HOA threw a block party that same evening. The final goodbye. With no money, no home, and no support, Karen had no choice but to leave Willow Creek Estates. Her last act before driving away, she flipped off the entire street, screaming, "You'll all be sorry when I'm gone." Tom, raising his own drink, called back, "We won't be." And with that, Karen was gone. For good. The neighborhood celebrated for days. And when Karen's house was put back on the market, Tom made sure to ask the realtor, "Does this place come with a Karen-free guarantee?" The realtor laughed. "Absolutely." And just like that, peace was restored. Karen got her karma.